Hi, welcome to Rainbows and Razor Blades and Watercolor Wizardry. Before we get started, I wanted to kick things off with a couple announcements. So a lot of our shows are on break right now. I keep forgetting which camera to look into. A lot of our shows are on break right now, so we're not going to have a ton of programming coming up. However, Watercolor Wizardry is still every week. Omalia is still every week, or MissGuided Magic. And then on the 28th, Thursday at 5:30 p.m., we are doing a one-shot for Stealing Stories for the Devil by Monty Cook. This is a Kickstarter-funded RPG that's mostly roleplay based. We're going to be doing a sort of demo of what it looks like. Oh, and next week, all of the shows on break will return. So just this week, we do not have things, except for MissGuided Magic and Watercolor Wizardry. So let's go ahead and get started. So we've finished all of the different characters and we're going to be working on doing a map for the world. So I do have a map, however, it's roughed out on my sketchbook. So when I usually do maps, there are a couple ways I do them. When I'm doing them for myself, I do the pencil really tiny, exactly how I want it. And then I kind of like loosey-goosey draw straight with ink onto the paper because if it changes a little, it's not a big deal. If I'm doing a commission map for someone, the colored pens come out and it gets a lot more complicated. And then I actually use a light board to trace it onto watercolor paper and I create a much smaller version of the map because I guess I could scan it, blow it up, print it, and then trace it onto something bigger if I had a bigger commission. But in general, I like to keep maps a little bit more freeform, especially when they're for my own world, because you're making it up and I don't think there's any particular reason like a certain type of coastline needs to be in a certain way, unless it's really specific to the story. And since it's my world, it doesn't particularly matter. So we're going to be going over just the general process of map making a little bit and how it varies from illustration. I'm going to set this up so I can see it as my reference, but I'm not going to be using it right this second because the first thing we want to do is to tone the paper. Now, if you're using like illustration board or canvas paper or canvas, usually you're going to do this with like gesso. But for watercolor, I like to use ink. So this is burnt umber ink and this is sepia ink. These are the two colors that I like to use. They feel sort of like old-timey brown. I'm going to put a little bit of each one in my palette. And burnt umber has a little bit more of a rich saturation. And sepia is a little bit darker and has a little bit more of a cool tint to it. Here, I'll put like a little swatch of each one so you can kind of see the difference. So up here we have burnt umber. You can see that like chocolatey rich brown. And then over here we have sepia, which is darker. And as we sort of fade it out, you can see there's a cooler tint to it. So in general, I think burnt umber has sort of a nicer, more homey, friendly feel to it. So that's what I'm going to tone everything with. But then when we go in, we start doing more specific details. I like to keep it darker and keep it more sepia toned, unless I'm doing things like forests that I want to kind of blend in a little bit, in which case we're going to go back and make it blend in with the map more. So I'm going to get a giant paintbrush, really, really wet. This is called a mop brush because it holds a lot of water. In fact, I'm going to take a pipette and I'm going to just sort of coat the surface here because I want to cover as much of this as possible and have the wash as smooth as possible. And then I'm going to get just a little bit of ink because a little goes a long way with ink. And as soon as I touch this, it's going to start sort of bleeding in and coloring the area. I'm going to move it all around. Be very careful about how much ink I actually add because you can't really go lighter. You can only go darker. And I want to keep it fairly light because we want it to look, you know, like toned canvas or something, or toned old paper. And I find that parchment often has kind of a yellowish feel to it. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a little bit of yellowed watercolor and I'll add that in on top of everything. Partially because it gives it some nice variation in tone, so it's not all the same color. And then partially because it gives a little bit more of that kind of parchment feel. Since paper tends to yellow when it ages. And I'm just going to take my entire napkin, and you see there's an area that we're getting a lot more water. That's because the fibers of the watercolor paper are expanding because they're all coming in contact with water. But because the entire page is not wet and because different parts are getting wet at different rates, some fibers are expanding more quickly. And so they're going to leave like a sort of buckled area because they can't move all the way out from the paper. So they're going to pop up or down. So this area is popping up, this area is popping down. So as your watercolor or ink wash is drying, one important thing to do is to make sure that the areas that are buckled down get dabbed up so that they don't end up drying and much, much darker. Though kind of in the middle of the continent is this place called the Fallen Grotto. So it would work a little bit if it was darker, but in general, I want to keep this pretty even. And right now it looks like there's some gaps in here. If I want, I can take a wet or damp brush and kind of push some of it back into place, but generally it'll kind of even out and it'll be what's called a smooth or a wet on wet wash. So it generally is just going to sort of bleed into everything else and it's going to look fine. Go ahead and label these. And then we need to wait for it to dry, which is going to take a minute. So some of the materials we're going to be using today are, this is a G-nib pen or G pen nib. It's from a company called Zebra. So I don't know how well you can see this, but it says, it has a big G on it. It says Zebra. If you search for G Zebra pen nib, this is wonderful. This is a comic quality pen nib. Manga artists use them to get really, really fine lines. I like using them for maps because you can get really, really tiny details in there, like all the little circles that you might use for trees, etc. And you can also push to get thicker lines. Usually I'll use this. Occasionally, for example, if I want to add like shadows to the side of mountains or something that feels a little bit lighter that isn't line work, which with maps is not very much, I'm going to use this really small Winsor Newton Series 7 watercolor brush. It has sable bristles, and I'm just going to be using inks today. Sometimes when I do watery areas, to distinguish them and to make it very clear that it's water, I will add a tiny, tiny bit of blue watercolor and just barely put a wash over there. You can see this is already creating another well. I need to dab it up again. I'll just barely put a wash in there. Sometimes if you prefer a more colorful map, you can add faint hints of color throughout. And it's not really going to make that much of a difference as long as you use a wash and you don't put very much pigment on your brush. The more diluted your pigment is on in your palette beforehand through water, the less you're going to notice it. If you have a very transparent wash, it's going to blend in with this sort of background tone, and it's actually going to look pretty good. I wouldn't worry too much about adding a ton of color though, because for the most part, I find that keeping it more or less monochromatic looks the most old-timey and sort of old fantasy map realistic. In general, I would recommend using colors that are desaturated. So kind of mix, if you really do want to use blue, you know, like water that blue down and then mix it with a tiny bit of white or a tiny bit of gray. Just give it something that doesn't feel really intense. If you have a kind of a crappy watercolor set, usually you'll only have a few really intense colors. And sometimes they don't dilute super well. They're still going to feel intense. So it depends. And it depends on your materials as well. So a couple things I am going to do just to sort of mark things out, because I don't usually use pencil lay-ins when I'm doing my final map, is I'm just going to continue dabbing this up a little bit. Sort of a constant process that you have to check on as it dries. Is I am going to take a ruler and I'm going to measure a few key areas on the map and just make a few notes to myself. For example, like I'll name a city and find, you know, where the midpoint of the map is and what city is closest to it. And then I'll make sure that city falls as close to the midpoint as possible. If you make an X through anything, the part at which the X crosses is going to be the middle. So all I need to do is just kind of make a visual X. And if you want to be really specific about it, like you can measure this out too, if you're worried about too many pencil lines getting on things. Let's see. 7. So the continent of Fendere is pretty much the middle of the map. It's a little bit above that. And that also tells me that the Fallen Grotto is pretty centrally placed. So half on the left, half on the right. And the grotto is going to be right above that midpoint. So that's a good just general midpoint that I'm going to aim for. I'll probably start with that and try and keep that in mind as I trace in the outline of the continents. The continent, I guess. Moving around, one thing that you want to do that's important is that usually when I have pencil lines, I draw the rough shape of the continent and I draw things like mountains on top of it. You want to make sure that you don't draw any lines around the edge, that you allow the mountains to be up and over the edge, anywhere on the right-hand side or the upper side. On the left-hand side, you're going to articulate the coast a little bit more. I did make a point to articulate the coast more here and here, but I got a little bit lazy when I was doing Oberus over here, which is a much sort of like broader coastline, because I knew it was going to be completely ringed in mountains and I didn't want to add a ton of details preemptively. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to articulate all the mountains on the top and then be a lot more specific about the coast. And now that I have a better idea of the world, this is a really good place to continue world building. So think about what you're using the different parts of the map for and what that would result in. So for example, I know that Oberus it's a sort of mini continent. It's surrounded by a magical sandstorm, and the farther in you go, the less likely you are to return. But there are a lot of sort of midway points set up and a lot of places here to receive trade, because there's a ton of valuable minerals and gems hidden in the mountains. So even though it's very dangerous, it's a very lucrative place to be. So I'm trying to think, well, if there was a small mining town, would they have had like a series of like docks or artificial land masses big enough to see on a map that are extended outwards, maybe so that they could live as, you know, like a couple miles away from the actual body of water as possible. And then maybe they can go in there to work just to keep themselves safe. Or would there be maybe a few divots as well that are a little steeper or sharper, where they've burrowed through the rock to a point where there isn't very much else left and it's essentially a path. So thinking about things like that before you model and redesign all of your coastlines is probably a good idea. There are a few areas, like I'm seeing a cove here, and I know that I put the cove here very arbitrarily, but I know that Freelos is a pirate city, or not a pirate city, but it's where like retired pirates go, because these mountains are pretty much impenetrable. So it sort of protects them from the law, and there's a ton of piracy on the sea here. So it would be a huge pain in the butt for like any of these countries to come around and try to arrest everyone here. So I would guess that they probably don't want anyone to be right over here, because this cove is kind of in between several mountains. So I'll probably either add another mountain here, or I'll fill in part of the cove. I do feel like sometimes you want to keep your natural instinct and just sort of leave things the way they are because it looks cool. But if it doesn't make sense mechanically, you either need to fill it in, or there could be like a pass here that's heavily guarded. I don't think they would have a ton of guards, but I don't know, maybe we have a monster here. I could put a tiny gate symbol or something. Yes, they are inks. So the inks we have are sepia and burnt umber. So we have burnt umber here and sepia here. Sepia is a lot darker and cooler. Burnt umber is a little bit warmer and friendlier. We're going to be doing most of the landscape in burnt umber, and then the writing and any really important points in sepia. The brand of the ink that I'm using is called FW. And I'd highly recommend it if you're going to be doing illustrated maps, because calligraphy ink is really beautiful. But let me show you the difference between calligraphy ink and FW ink, because when you see it together, it's actually very stark. Calligraphy ink is just not acrylic, so it's not like plastic based. Essentially, it's water based, which for calligraphy that works great, because the whole reason that you want calligraphy is because you want it to sort of glide as gracefully as possible off of your pen nib. However, when you use a calligraphy ink, because it's so it's designed to be as watery as possible, they can't put as much I guess, because acrylic is almost like plastic based, they can't put as much unnatural materials in there Otherwise, it would kind of gunk up the nib eventually. And FW ink will do that after time. If you have FW ink on your nib for a long time and you continue drawing with it and you don't clean your nib really frequently, it'll mess up your nib and it doesn't flow as well. You have to water it down a little bit to get any really good consistency. And the longer you leave it out, the more trouble you're going to have. It turns into like a sort of gummy paint almost, but you can get some really gorgeous opaque color with it. And FW ink is waterproof. So if you decide that you want to draw something and then you want to go over it with like a glaze and work part of the map or like add little trees on top of a line and part of your hand is wet and smudges it, that line is going to smudge. Calligraphy ink is a lot less forgiving smudge wise, but you can smudge it. It's a little more like watercolor. But with maps, whereas with paintings, that's a little more forgivable. With maps, you want really hard to find lines because that's sort of the point of the map, is to show where these borders are, where these mountains are. And if it's smudged, it kind of defeats the purpose. So calligraphy ink, let me put some in my pipette. Not sure how easy this is for you to see. Oh, got a little drop over there. That's okay. If I grab it and I put it on my nib and I move my nib forward, I'm barely putting any pressure and I'm getting this beautiful different width of line. However, if I do the same thing with some of my ink over here, first of all, it's not going to bead as neatly on top. And then when I draw, it's just a little less flowy. I'm putting a tiny bit more pressure so you can see the line is ever so slightly less consistent. I don't think there's that much of a difference if you're cleaning things frequently and if you're not doing like hundreds and hundreds of letters, which like envelope addressing and stuff is a lot of what calligraphy inks are used for. So it's kind of hit or miss. If you're doing your own calligraphy project or map project, it's sort of up to you what you want to take or leave. At this point, the map is still damp. I'm wondering if I should have just toned it beforehand. So usually what I'll do is I'll like place a book on it and then I'll walk away for like 15 minutes and let it dry. But we're just going to work on some wiggly stuff today. All right. Let's see. I feel like we need another like 5 to 10 minutes just to make sure there's no bleed. You can kind of see on the spots where the ink spilled right here, it's already smudged away a little bit. And that smudge means that if I start drawing a line, that line is going to bleed out as opposed to staying really pristine, which for maps is quite important. If you're painting skin tones, you kind of want that. And this is where most of your painting is going to get done, in this sort of twilight stage between dry and wet. Yes, calligraphy ink does look thinner. It's more water-based. There's less substance to it. Anyway, the sort of twilight stage between dry and wet is usually where you want to do most of your painting if you're rendering like skin tones or anything that isn't going to be 100% hard. If you want to do like a forest background that doesn't have to be quite as detailed as the foreground, you don't need really sharp lines. This is a good spot to do it. All right. But we need everything to be dry. Probably wait a minute. Let's see some other map tips. Oh, I would strongly suggest finding a different, first of all, finding a different color or font or way of drawing the country names versus the city names, making them really clear. One thing I like to use, it's actually just a Papermate pen, but it's this really gorgeous burgundy color that I think has a lot of brown in it. You almost can't see that it's red from here. It looks brown, but it has just the faintest hint of burgundy. Burgundy is my favorite color anyway. And I use that for the country names, but then I keep the city names in ink. This is not a waterproof pen. I looked forever to find a Micron pen that was in a decent color because Micron pen ink is waterproof and that would be a lot easier. But all of Micron's colors, like this is the closest thing they have, this is red, are super, super garish. But I guess it could work for like a sci-fi map. Anyway, this is sort of the basis of what I use this, and then make sure you have a font that you like. that you are copying for the different names, I promise you, not everyone can read your handwriting, even if you have somewhat neat handwriting. And also if you use your handwriting as opposed to sort of copying a font, it's going to feel like you're, I guess it's going to feel more hand drawn, which this map is hand drawn, but it's, I guess, going to feel a little more, less old timey, and a little bit more like scrawl. You want it to feel a little more official. So there's this font I really like. And I don't know what it's called, but it's the font they use for Lord of the Rings. So I usually just search for like Lord of the Rings stuff and I copy the alphabet that I see on there. And because Lord of the Rings just feels so like old world mappy to me. So if you look around, you can usually see like on various maps or like other fan pieces, you can get a sense. It's not necessarily like a full showing, which is what it's called when the font is fully laid out. But you can get a sense of how they write some of their letters. One thing about like Tolkien world stuff is that a lot of the letters that you see have a lot of big bowls to them. So the bowl of the letter is like the curve of a D or a B or an O. They're very circular. Or they're very sharply angled up and they're kind of long. And then I try to add a lot of areas where there's like a defined sort of dip or swirl that curves ever so slightly. And all of those things feel very fantasy to me. So over the years, I've just, as I've drawn something, I've slowly perfected how I draw. Yeah, there's like a ton of different versions. I don't think there's a set Lord of the Rings font. But find out what you like the best and what works for you and practice it a few times before you actually draw it, because I promise it's going to be harder than you think. When you draw fonts, the general rule, and this goes for drawing from reference as well, is that you always want to look at your original font or like reference or source, whatever you're copying something from, as opposed to what else is written on the page, because you're going to get the most accurate copy and the accurate reading from the original source. It's like playing a game of telephone. You don't want to hear what someone is whispering 3 people down. You want to hear the original audio. It's the same thing where you want to see the original font on here. So take some time, practice the letters a few times. I don't know if I'm going to put Omalia actually written out here. I might actually add it later, but we'll do everything else. Usually country names come last, city names come second to last, and it's the bulk of the land that we're going to spend the majority of the time drawing, mostly because I don't want anything over the city names. So first of all, I'm going to use darker ink for them. And I'm also going to be putting them on top of everything else. And since ink, especially when it's watered down to an extent, is a layering medium, it doesn't necessarily mean that like you can still get a wash of something else over your city name. And it lets us sort of plan out where to place things. Oh, I'm glad. All right, let's see if this is dry enough. I think it's getting close. I'm sorry this is taking so long. I want to be really cautious with this. So I'm just going to take some time to allow it to dry. It's still got a damp feel to it. I think in the corners over here, it's probably okay. There are a couple areas in here where it's not. I'm going to just kind of press it gently with a paper towel and try and soak some of the moisture out of it. It's a little too dry, I think, to fully like get the paper towel effect, which is just the texture of everything in the paper towel. If you press it down while something is damp and then lift it up, you get an impression of that texture. But if you do it when it's still kind of damp, it's going to fill in that texture to some point. So you don't actually see the pattern of the paper towel on your final, but you get the impression that there's some sort of texturing there, which makes it look instantly a little bit more complicated. Hi, Hermes. All right. I'm just waiting for paper to dry so we can start maps. And the paper towel is getting a tiny bit damp, so I do think it is helping. I'll switch between a couple different paper towels, but really sometimes you just got to let it dry. You have to be patient with watercolor. It's my favorite medium, because I love how organic it is and how much things bleed, but it really has a mind of its own, in which like you can't necessarily choose what is going to happen when you put something down. You can sort of control it if you know it really well and you know what direction it's going to go. It reminds me of, it's like kind of the cat of the painting world, I think, where it's going to do whatever it wants to do, but you can sort of encourage it one way or another. Whereas oil paint, you have a huge amount of control over because it takes so long to dry and you can keep adding layers. Same with acrylic, it dries quicker, but you can always add on top of it. And then gouache is kind of a mix between acrylic and watercolor, where you can water it down and treat it like watercolor when it's wet, but then it's permanent when it dries. I used to do painting with colored acrylic ink, which I liked a lot, but it is permanent. So you're more likely to get these really harsh lines. So if you like watercolor vibes, but you want something a little harsher and more graphic, you might want to get into FW ink painting, which is just painting with these acrylic artist inks. I had a teacher in college that I really admired, and all his professional work was with acrylic ink, and that's what kind of got me into it. And then I generally, I think by the end, no, it was after I graduated. Within like a couple of years after I graduated, completely transitioned over to like watercolor with just a little bit of ink, which I like for getting darks. If you want to look up what ink paintings look like, his name is Jeffrey Smith. If you look for Jeffrey Smith art, he has a lot of really graphic, sort of Gothic style pieces. I think we're okay on the edges, maybe. Still not in the middle. I don't know, does anyone have any questions about map making? I might wait a little for this. Usually what I do for the different terrains is you want to pick something that represents something else. So I have pretty big mountains the way I draw them. Sometimes people do them really small. I kind of like big mountains, and I like adding little shadows on the sides. This is my mountain symbol. I'll do big ones and large ones. For grasslands, I have just 3 tiny lines. And it's the idea of simplifying something into a symbol so that it can be seen on like a map key. So for example, the tiny little lines mean grasslands, the circles mean forests. And then circles mean forest. Oh, and then just sort of like the tiny little dotted lines mean hills or hill land. So we have a lot of hilly land in Findere, and then up in Amafrid over here. And then significant land masses you want to add. Usually for cities, I'll put a dot to show where the city is, because if you have the whole name of the city there, you don't necessarily know where it is. And then I just do a little star for the capital. And I keep it pretty small for the capital. I know some people do it a little larger. I've got like a little volcano symbol here. I just do sort of swirls for the lakes. And then sometimes I put a tiny bit of blue watercolor on them. I think while we're waiting for it to dry, I might go get some finished maps and kind of show you guys the different vibe and the difference between a city map and a world map. All right, so I've got a few maps here. I'm not entirely sure where some of my better ones are, but I do have these, which are much earlier maps. So this was for a city I did that's made out of trees. So it was 3 layers. And this was a lot of fun because it was like these enormous trees, and the branches were so numerous and wide that boards had been placed over them in order to make this city. So we have the understory, which is where most of the trees are. And there were these giant riding lizards that would take you up and down like elevators to different parts. And there were 3 stories to the city. So we had the understory, and you can see the use of this font. There's a really distinct way that I do T's that feels kind of old timey, and I pull the bottoms of the H's and the N's down. Just little dots where things are. At this point, I probably, if I did this again today, I would probably add a few more symbols and not have it quite as spread out, probably, just so that the text feels a little smaller and a little more relevant. And then the higher up they went, I used a light table and I traced over where the points were, where the trunks were. And then I added like a smaller version here. So now they're separated. And so you'd have to take a riding lizard like up over here in order to get to here, and then back down to get anywhere else. But it's only connected on the bottom. And then at the very top are just like a few things. This is where like the canopy is. So people exposed to sunlight were very wealthy. So these are mostly like private residences of very important people in the city, and a couple different things like gardens for food production, stuff like that. But you get the idea where you're seeing the differences between the dark text and the light text. The light text is what I use to get different types of land, I guess. And then the dark text, which is done in sepia, this is done in burnt umber. The dark text is to give names. And then for big things, for example, country names or the names of the type of thing that's there, I'm using this burgundy pen over here just to make it stand out. And then what I do is I scan this, I put it in Roll20, and I have it up as the map for players to look at while we play. And if I'm doing, now I use Dungeon Draft, which is so much easier. But if I were to do a battle map, I kind of do a mix of those things. So there are a few areas that I might really like to tile, or I might really like to add specific pieces into. A lot of it is done just with 3-point perspective, looking vertically on things, but then I let myself get a little bit more symbolic for other stuff. So for example, the fire, I guess it goes this way. The fireplace is, vertical, and it's more of a symbol than anything else. And you can kind of get away with that when you're drawing maps because people aren't expecting realism, they're expecting communication. And with all art, communication is expected, but with maps, you kind of get a pass on rendering. And you get a pass on changes of style because it's meant to communicate an idea more than it's meant to communicate like this is a rendering of what something looks like. No one's going to expect a vertical map to look like a vertical like Google Street View or something. Everybody assumes that this is the idea of a bed, the idea of a couch. And if you draw it in a different way each time, as long as they can understand what's there, you can kind of get away with it, especially if you only have a few set areas where you switch things up. So for example, I wanted a vertical view here because these spell circles were very important to the piece. And I wanted to make the bathroom feel really special because there's all these spell circles in the tub for healing. It's sort of like a healer's hut. So I really wanted to draw attention to this. So I let myself draw out all the little tiles on here, and I had a lot of fun with the patterning. And then I added patterning here and a little bit on the edges, but I kept everything else kind of blank. And in general, when you're doing something like this, patterning is going to draw focus unless everything is patterned, in which case your eyes are going to glaze over it like it's all the same. So what you want to do is create areas of focus that have a lot of detail in them, or you want to create areas of contrast. So areas of contrast are going to be anything that's dramatically dark against dramatically light paper, or dramatically light against dramatically dark paper. So it's a lot easier to do dark than it is to do light. So just pick the areas where you want things to be darker or denser or more patterned. That's where your eye is going to be drawn to. So if you want to, for example, hide something on your map, have a ton of patterning and stick the thing inside the pattern because your eyes are going to glaze over it. Or have almost no patterning and just have it in there kind of fitting, like the consistency of where you're placing things, and put a ton of patterning somewhere else because the patterning or the darkened areas are where everybody is going to look. And unless they're really scanning the map and looking for small details, they're not really going to pay attention to the other things that are on here. I have a bunch of maps from my last home game, but I think they're in a separate folder and I cannot find them right now. I still don't want to draw with this. I'm so sorry. It just feels damp still. I probably should have done this morning and then just waited for it to dry. But I'm feeling it and it feels too wet. I know it's going to bleed if I put anything on it. I think what we might do, let's see, I have some I have like one thing of pre-washed paper that I could use for something. Something like this. That could work. Let's do like a warm-up piece or something while we wait for this to dry. Kristen, are you on? You know, Kristen had like a sketched map for something. Or at least I thought she did. Okay. Well, I'm going to very quickly try and scroll through a couple of the different chats. There's so many threads on Discord. I want to see if I can find where she put this drawn map. Maybe we can do like a fancy version of it. Maybe not. I don't know. Kat, do you happen to know where it is? I know, like right when I joined the Discord, I saw it. No, okay, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and look up some aerial view photos of some different terrains, and let's go ahead and just draw something else. Let's do a battle map. We can do a bunch of different plants. I really like drawing plants, so let's do like a swamp or something. There's going to be a lot of plants there. So usually what we'll do is I'm just going to get a few areas in here that have a really, really light wash. I'm just going to start sort of mapping things in. So what you want to do when you're doing a battle map is kind of figure out where players can move or where you might want them to move. So swamps have lots of water. So let's first of all, very lightly kind of sketch in where we want some of the water to be. And I feel like there needs to be like a reason for a battle usually. So sometimes that reason can be story-based, and sometimes that reason can come from, you know, like them stumbling into like the territory of something. I'm thinking mostly like rolling on a random encounter table for travel. So maybe there's a series of rocks in here. And when you're doing objects that are in water, you can add like tiny little ripples around them. And depending on how big of a scale the map is, like how many tokens, think about how big or how many people you want to be able to get on here. Like maybe 3 characters could get on here. So this will be like 3, you know, like 1, 2, 3 grids. So that gives me the idea that, you know, like these are pretty substantial looking rocks. Maybe this is like a pathway to something, and maybe there's like a monster lair over here or something like that. Or, I mean, often rocks are not in a deliberate pathway on purpose. Maybe they were planted here, or maybe this is like the ruins of something. So maybe let's start by sketching out the idea of like an ancient foundation that's kind of been overgrown with something. I promise we are still going to be drawing the main map. I just want to give it more time to dry. So we're going to do a little side project. I'm going to say it's probably something that they need to cross, because if they could just go around, why bother with this? So I'm going to sort of have this run off the edge. I'll give like a little bit of a bank here. And sometimes this can look a little bit more like shallows. Just see, like, so first of all, to emphasize where the edge of the water is, and also to just add a little bit more detail. Continuing to get my nib wet, just to make sure that, first of all, no part of the ink dries on it. But also I want to kind of keep the balance between ink and water pretty mixed, because I don't want it to get too dark here. This isn't the part that I necessarily want to emphasize. This is sort of the background area that I want to fall backwards, sort of out of the picture. I want the players to be able to see it and know that it's there, but I don't want them to spend a huge amount of time on it. Right, and maybe I want to put something kind of fantasy-esque in here. Let's have some like giant lily pads maybe. And at this point, I've kind of done looking at reference. Since maps you don't have to look at reference necessarily to get it right. You're just kind of drawing the idea of something. So I'm going to say these are lily pads, that maybe if players are able to make the jump on there, they like move forwards for a while before stopping. They could ride on them maybe. We have lily flowers, so maybe let's have a couple little flowers on here so it doesn't look super, super ominous. And you can add like little veins and stuff to the leaves if you want, but honestly, like I really don't think you have to add that much detail. As long as you're getting the gist of something, that's all you really need with the map. I do want this area to be darker, so I'm going to go in with a little bit of water on my nib, but mostly just ink. And here are these foundations. Say some part of the stone kind of broke and has fallen over here. Some grass coming out of it. Just to give a general area of abandonment, the more sort of like flowers, moss, leaves that you add to things, the more they're going to feel like no one's really taking care of them. So in general, when you're drawing something in 3D perspective, if you want to give it a little bit of height, all you need to do is to draw 2 lines moving inwards toward the same direction, and then draw another straight line. If you draw the line straight up or straight out, it's not going to look very 3D. And I want to emphasize there still is water here. This is just sort of coming out of the stone. And then maybe over here we have like a tiny area that is coming out of the water. And I've decided these are coming out of the water. We can also add like some little ripples around here to sort of make it clear that there's another environment around them. This is also a great time to go in with like some very transparent pale blue watercolor and just give a tiny bit of color to show where things are. One general tip is if you want to show that something has height, you're drawing these lines and showing like the bottom of something. You don't want this to then be on this side. You're showing that we're looking a little bit to, because if you look directly on top of something, unless there's something wider beneath it, you're not going to see anything below it. So you're implying when you add these bottom areas that you're tilted ever so slightly towards one direction. So if you start drawing the areas where we can see the bottom of the rocks on this side, but not on the other side, then you're implying that we're now tilted in the other direction. And we no longer believe the map because that perspective is not consistent with what we're seeing on the rest of the map, and it's going to make it look bad. In general, you want to keep all of the different directions that you're turning aligned to the same place. Otherwise, it's going to look like you're looking at multiple different reference sources when creating your map, and it's just not going to look that good. So for example, if I have this line here, then this now looks like it's at a different angle than this. Unless the rock is just smaller on top over here. All right, let's put like some sort of a nest here or something. I don't know, what lives in a swamp that has a nest? I don't know, we'll put some different leaves and stuff in here though. When you make leaves or trees or whatever, at a sort of macro level, when you're doing like a world or continent map, you want everything to be the same because it's more about being a symbol. The more you zoom in, the more you want to differentiate between things and the more they're going to look like individual things. So for example, I want all these leaves to look ever so slightly different. And I know we're seeing this area on the outside a little bit more. I'm just going to add some minor cross hatching to show that there's a dip. All right. Let's go ahead and add in a little bit with blue watercolor. I'm going to go in and start giving like a tiny bit of color to this. This looks pretty dark, but I am intending to spread it out. We'll add a little bit of green in there since it's swamp water. I noticed that this color is pretty desaturated. There was some gray mixed in with what I dropped. The more saturated your color is, the more garish your map is going to look. It's not going to feel like a old, tiny, hand-drawn map. All right, and at this point, I'm just going to switch to a smaller brush. As we're getting closer now, I need to start articulating some details. You want to go around everything else. If you draw everything or paint everything with a little bit of blue on top of it, everything is going to look like it's underwater. which is fine. If you're doing an underwater map, put a glaze of blue over everything when you're finished with it. And if there are just a couple things that are not touching the surface, that can be a great way to differentiate depth. But when you're trying to show that some things are underwater and some things are not, for example, the things on top, or to show that something is a body of water, you need to slow down and trace around things. Otherwise, it's not going to look good. It's going to feel kind of sloppy. It's okay if you make some mistakes. Don't feel like, you're not being judged that harshly. Your players are going to love whatever you make. They're going to love that you spent time on something. Yep, I just went over one of the little rocks there. I'll just say that one's underwater. There are some rules to map making, but in general, it's not really high pressure. Probably would be working a little more slowly and a little more carefully if I was working on a commission. But I've never had a player criticize me for adding too much blue on something or anything like that. People are there to have a good time. People just want to play D&D and look at cool art. No one's going to judge you harshly. They're going to, well, if they're good players, they will appreciate deeply the amount of work you put into prepping things. Yeah, and just try and have fun with it. DMing is a fun activity as well, especially if you let yourself enjoy it and don't take yourself too seriously. And the nice thing about maps, especially if they're not super specific, you can reuse them. So if the players, if you made this whole, encounter thing, assuming they'll meet up with some sort of, I don't know, swamp nest monster, you can throw something else at them that also has a swamp nest, or you can put this at the edge of an island and there's something completely different in the nest. There's like this lost tropical bird they've been sent to find by some lord who collects parrots. Something like that. In general, I'd suggest not going hyper specific with a map unless you're 1000% sure that your players are going to actually use it. And even then, they may subvert you, and not on purpose, but if you're playing the game right, you should be open to letting them change things and surprise you. Oh, hi, Beth. I'm waiting for the watercolor paper for the world map to dry. So we're doing like a map exploration exercise with like a little watery area. All right. And then if it is a swamp, I think there should be probably patches of water throughout. So we'll create a few other areas just to make it feel just sort of wet in general. Just add a few dotted lines on the inside, and then when you add the color, it'll read as water. Again, the closer you get, the more you do want to differentiate between small details. For example, like if you're going to draw individual leaves and they're not just meant to represent something, but you're actually showing like, these are the leaves of this nest, then you do want them to look a little different, but you don't have to draw them better. You're giving the impression of differentiation. You're not expected to draw a leaf so accurately that we know how many petals, the flower of it has or something. I'm just drawing some squiggly shapes. There are a bunch of tips for doing various types of world maps if you want to figure out what a body of water looks like, what a continent looks like. My favorite is the orange peel method. And that's not how I did this map, but it is how I did the map that I play with in Beth's game. And it's where you peel an orange and you try and put the pieces back together, and you try and peel the orange in as many or in as few parts as possible. So you have one large piece, and then you lay them flat and you place the other pieces where you think they might fit, but leave a little bit of space between them. And then you take a picture of that, and the outline of that is what your coastline looks like, and that's what your landmass looks like. And it works because orange peels at one time, were completely together. So when you pull them apart and just move them out, it's believable that they used to be part of the same continent. And because they're sort of naturally have like a teared, roughened edge, they read as things with interesting coastlines. And if you look at it for reference, you can find something interesting there usually. Battle maps, usually don't want to make them overly complicated unless there's like, unless you're a really big fan of complicated stuff. Just say that they're kind of in between a swampy area and moving along it. One thing you want to make sure you do is when you mix up a color for something like water, you want to use that watercolor for everything unless you are specifically drawing attention to a different type of water. You don't want to have a greenish blue and then, a purplish blue unless there's a reason for it. Like, oh, this one is swampy, this one is poisonous, this one is something else. So mix up plenty of whatever color you're planning to use. Unless there's a specific reason you would use a different color or a different mix of a color. And this particular paper is not amazing. So it's usually if you have nicer cut paper, your washes will not create that harsh line, but that's where I ripped I think the side of it off of where the sheet was. No, it must have been at the top. It's just not great quality paper. If you want to get good quality paper, like the best quality paper I could recommend is probably Arches. Like their watercolor pads, especially hot press, are really, really nice, but that's very, very pricey. So if you want something that you can practice on and use like a lot, that's okay quality. I really like the XL brand by Canson. This brand. That's not the brand I got this from. This is, I think, just like something from a dollar store or whatever. But I liked the tooth on it. I was hoping it would work, but I kind of knew it was a shot in the dark because it was not great quality. But the tooth is really cool and it makes it look like old paper. So I don't know. I still think it looks kind of cool, but I'll probably, I think I have one more piece of this prepped, but I think after that I probably won't use it again. And then Strathmore is also like a nice in-between brand. Their cold press sheets have some texture to them. It can be kind of nice. Right. And then I think what we'll do is just add like a few plant life areas. And then maybe a few tree canopies, and we'll be pretty much done with this. And then we can move on to the main map because I think it's pretty much dry. I just felt it. Keep in mind, if this holds 3 people, these are huge leaves. These are huge bodies of water. I really like drawing things small and blowing them up because I think when regular size things get like enormous, it makes things feel way more fantastical and fun. Again, it's up to you how much detail you want to add. And if you want to color these, you can. You could do a faded, yellowish green. You don't have to. And for trees, you want to kind of draw a circle, but you want to keep it as bumpy as possible. You want a few indents. You might want a few like holes in the canopy. And then trees have layers, just like onions and ogres. So you're going to want to have a couple of different areas like this. They don't necessarily have to be connected, but like concentric circles where you can see the tree getting taller. So we can see there's some like low, middle, and high boughs. And that's good enough. You don't even need to draw a trunk. The trunk is always under the tree, unless it like the roots seep out a ton or something. Drawing dead trees is the worst because you have to draw all the branches and roots looking from the top. Not all of them, just like the idea of them, but it's kind of a pain. If you want to communicate that these are trees and not bushes, you can add the hint of a root or something, or you can add like a little bit of a shadow underneath it. But I don't think it makes that much of a difference. Like I've never had players complain about it. I just tell them it's a tree and they act as if it's a tree. If they're confused, they'll say something. Probably not very tall trees. Otherwise, I think they would warp a little bit more. I think that works. Yeah, I think as far as maps go, it's fine. I think this is ready to draw on, so let's go ahead. I'm just gonna add some like swampy greens to some of these. So if you have a different color for trees and different color for leaves, that's fine because we assume it's a different kind of plant. It's when you have the exact same thing and it's colored differently that it's going to be a little bit confusing. And here we go. We got a little like swamp map. I'll put it in the DM chat if any of our other fellow DMs want to use it. I'll have to see about sharing more content at some point if we end up doing some generic stuff. Maybe if Kat ever sets up like a Patreon or something, that could be a tier reward. All right. Yeah, this is fine. So going back to our main map. I'm going to set this over here. All right, I'm just going to take some ink and go right in. So I know that the Fallen Grotto needs to be right about here or here. So looking up on the side, I'm going to start on the left-hand coast because the left-hand coast is the one where I'm actually going to draw the coastline. I'm going to try and stick the top of a moth reed up over here. So I'm going to start with the highest mountain over there. And if the paper is, has any tooth to it, your pen won't be completely straight if you have really light pressure, unless you're moving very quickly. I like to take advantage of this by going really, really slowly and kind of letting the tooth direct how things are drawn because it's going to give it a more natural feel. And again, as long as you get the gist of things in here, it's not a huge deal. If this is your own map, if it's someone else's map, you need to ask them what's important. The game that I played in with our two close friends for like 4 years, for Christmas one year, I made a world map for our DM and he had like a bazillion cities and I had him like sit down with me and I went over like all the different cities that he wanted. And I got pretty much all of it in, except there was one city that I forgot. And I sent it to him, like I sent a scan to him and he was like, I think that's good. Let me check it. And then he responded and he's like, oh, you forgot this one city. And I was like, oh, sorry. Like, so I like got it back out and I just like filled it in, sent him a picture. I was like, here you go. And so when he showed us the world map when we were playing, he didn't show the picture. He showed like, or he didn't show the scan. He showed like the crappy picture I'd sent to him because he had the original, but I don't think he ever bothered to scan it. And I was like, huh, that's weird. And then it turned out that town that I'd forgotten that was super tiny was like insanely significant. And there was like a secret city buried in the mountain behind it. And it ended up being a huge part of the campaign. I felt really bad about it. But the rest of the map works. But I think he was hesitant to tell me how important it was because we hadn't gotten to that part of the campaign yet. So here I'm just kind of following the coastline, trying to find any areas that are important. And I got out to here, which is the widest point. And then I want to leave enough room for the name, which I can stick over here. But I want to make sure that I don't get too, like I don't want to draw this out and make it too long because then I won't have room for the map on the bottom. So I want to make sure that the grotto is about here, which is just above the midpoint where I measured earlier. So I want to make sure that this is sort of like the base guideline that I follow. And for me, if the rest of the coast is a little wonky, it doesn't matter because no one's backstory is from here. And the world is fleshed out to the point where I know the specifics of some cities and I know a few things and I know a lot of stuff about the countries. But I do not know very much at all about really specific coastal areas. So it's okay if I am pretty general with that. So right now I'm just drawing islands as best I can. And I'm probably going to go back with a really light wash and maybe add some like areas of like rippled water or whatever. But for now, and because I don't want to be going back and forth, I'm going to try and do this top loop of the continent first. So if I look at this, I think the midway point, like over here, is going to be where this little peninsula is. It's probably not called a peninsula because it can be seen on a continent map. I'm going to go down to this long river. And that's going to be sort of like a marker. So knowing that this area is up here, I'm just going to connect these two dots. So as I go through, I want to make sure that as I draw things in, I have a point A and a point B in mind, and it's going to stop me from getting really out of proportion. So far, I feel like it's more or less accurate. So what I could do is I could have drawn the entire thing here really lightly in pencil and gone over it. But when you scan it, especially if you scan it at like a really nice DPI, like I like my world maps to be at, you can sometimes see the pencil. You can sometimes not erase all of it. And I want it to feel a little bit more pristine. Plus, usually when I'm creating maps, I erase things and I don't want to leave eraser marks on this because it'll just stress the paper. If you do it too much, it can look really bad. You won't notice that it looks bad, but then when you add water over it, that area where you erased a lot is dramatically darker and it looks horrible. I didn't want any of that. That's why I usually do the rough draft of my maps on a separate, smaller piece of paper. Okay, and then kind of figuring out where the grotto is and moving to the right-hand side and noticing that, first of all, this needs to come in at some point. And it needs to end about here at this same point. So I'm going to draw, instead of going to the top down, I'm going to go from the bottom up now, and I'm going to try and keep things in here as much as possible. won't say whose, but there is some backstory stuff that takes place here. So I can't really omit any of the cities because I forgot to include the landmass that they're on. I'm just going to have to condense some things. And, you know, like I said, it's okay if it's not perfect. Most of it's there. We're all good. All right, I know this area and this area are like the closest area that the continent touches, the continent of Oberis, which is the magical sandstorm one we were talking about. So I'm going to go through and just make sure that everything else moves out and away, or at least doesn't move this close. So this is not a good area. I know that this area comes out to maybe here, but that's a farther distance than here. So I'm just going to add a couple small points as I move back and forth between things. Again, I needed to add a coastline here, so I'm going to start adding some areas that are a little more specific as I move up. And I know that this comes in. You just need it to be specific enough that you can find your place on here as you start lettering things later on. And then now as the map turns, we're going to get to where some of these mountains are. So we're going to start seeing the mountains through other things. Oh, are you working on a world map, Beth? Okay, kind of taking this out to its largest point. I know there's a couple islands up here. I think maybe I made this a little tall. Looking at my original map, actually, I probably should have kept these farther down because this area has a taller point. But it's okay. I'm just going to move the island off to the side a little bit. It's okay if they're the same height. And then once I have this, this will be kind of the official map. And I don't have to do it again. So this will be kind of set as where everything is. And then I'll scan it. And then as people go to certain towns, sometimes I'll make a map of the town. But it depends. It depends on how long I think they'll spend there. If they're just passing through, that doesn't usually happen. I need to make some like generic town art or something. It's very tough not being able to just grab things off the internet, which was always so easy with home games. I was hoping to use this like really amazing AI landscape generator called Wombo, but I checked, one of the other DMs told me they were weird about licensing, and I checked and they are, and they like, apparently like the main complaint is like, this is super cool, but you can't use it for anything. So I'm not going to be able to use that. But if anyone has any other landscape AI generators, there's this wonderful generator called Artflow, which their copyright laws do let you use things as long as you credit them. And they do AI NPCs. And we actually have somebody in the one shot later today who is generated by Artflow. So I have to remember to thank them. I'm very excited about that. And I saw that they do have a landscape feature, but I have not used it yet. It'd be great if that worked out. We'll see. When you get to the top and to the right-hand side, you want to emphasize the mountains. And then this needs to come into here. And this needs to be fairly small. So this needs to come out like this. And the coastline here needs to be completely covered in mountain. So that'll take a second. And it looks fairly simple now, but when we get into details, we're going to add a little bit more cross hatching, like a little bit more articulation of some of these mountains. We just want to make sure we pay attention to them. Right. And this area had a part that pointed outwards, but I guess it doesn't have that anymore. That's okay. It's the price you pay for winging it. Right. Once we have the basic landforms, then we're going to start filling in the mountains, the really significant land masses, the bodies of water. And then we'll start on small things like forests, grasslands, etc. And keep this area pretty enclosed. Trying to make the coves and stuff. They were smooth. I'm trying to make them a little bit more modeled just to show where things have been like mined and added in. And there are a few islands here. I want to add some inlets too. I know this area is big on piracy, so I want to make sure that there may be some like surreptitious sort of hidey holes or coves where you could dock a ship. And then if this is here, there needs to be a mountain over here. Come down. And then I need to just kind of do mountains all over the side here. So I know there's an area where it comes in, and I'm going to draw a mountain there. And then I'll just draw a few like sort of staple mountains, I guess, and do smaller ones throughout. In general, most people have not traveled here before, so I can keep it kind of vague. They know there's some sort of body of water here, but they don't know how it ends. They just assume it's like a lake or something, probably because they've seen the inlet. Okay, I'd say that works pretty well. And then, all right, moving down, let's connect these two areas. I like to work in like smaller pieces, if possible. So I know that this area is where the grotto starts. I'm going to push it in here. And then this area is where the grotto starts. I'm just going to draw some of the area for that here so I know where it starts, creating like a couple landmarks. So when this comes down in, I also know there's a lake area over here. And this comes in and becomes sort of a gentle cove. Okay. All right. So I want to make sure that I fit everything in. So I'm going to add where this swamp starts over here. I want to make sure that It ends on the bottom third. So if this is a third, 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 it can end down here. I know that's super rough. There are these three mountains here. All right. Feels like a significant body of water. And then we have the islands starting here and over here. So we have to figure out where everything ends. So I know that over here are the Galaros Islands, and there's a cove that sort of drips off the side. So I want to make sure that as this comes out, it comes in enough that the islands can fit in over here. And there's a big swampy area that I want to go around. It's like a ton of little islands. Okay. And it needs to end around here. I'm just copying lines that I've already drawn. Adding in the islands later because none of the islands are super significant. I'm going to have this pull out. And then there's a cove here, and that's sort of the edge of the map, so I can let that come out more. Okay, and then we have some significant islands over here. I know one starts up here. One over here, and one over here. And there's some little islands that just to sort of pepper things in. And then moving down here, we have the coin islands. So one thing that's important is that you don't want to leave a ton of big gaps in things, but you do need to leave enough gaps that you can still write out the names of things. So drawing these different areas over here, I'm going to make sure that the coin islands fit into this area. So I am going to leave like a space or a gap. And if you have a lot of patterning around a given area, if the area that is blank is filled up with text, sometimes people will assume there's more there than there actually is, and it's not going to read as a strange gap where you fit something in. Okay. And then, you know what I might do? Because I kind of want to spread these islands out. I'm going to see if I can expand this. Nah, I'll still be able to see it. Okay, we'll just make it fit. That'll be fun to give a little bit more spread here with the islands. but it's not a big deal. Oh, and I want to make sure I fill in these little gaps here before I forget. Actually, I think this is a little too long. That's probably why I wanted a little more space here. But it's okay. And if you want to measure things out and convert them to from, whatever scale you drew the original map at, you can. In general, I don't think it's that important. The main thing is you don't want these lines to be really, really uniform in shape. Like you don't want an island that's a circle, even if it's supposed to be a circle. You want an island that has a little bit of a wobble to the circle because coastlines don't grow in perfect circles unless it's like a really unnatural kind of magic place. All right, and then I want to take a break from this side and move in over here and just make sure I get, see, I know that the swamp is pretty much congruent with this pirate city. And this is going to move in a lot. So I'm going to say this is the curve of where the coast is going to come up. And there's sort of a distinct point here. That's the point we were talking about earlier where I was going to add another mountain. So you don't want to have anywhere toward the top where there's mountains. You don't want any land. You want to just draw the mountains because those will cover everything. I think this will come in a little bit in behind the mountain. Okay, and I know there's area here. All right, and now we're getting to the point where there's this long kind of flat area and a swoop, and I want to start connecting these things together. So I'm going to bring this area up just a little bit so that swoop can fit in there nicely. And I know that I want this area to be able to come out and around. We'll fit that swoop in over here. All right, and we've got a few islands to do here and then some on the side, and then we're going to be done with the outline. I think it's almost 6. I'm tempted to maybe just do a 2-hour stream because I think at that point we'll be about halfway done. We could go a little bit longer, just sort of rough in the mountains at least, and maybe the lakes. But then after that, we'll probably give it a rest and finish it next week. Because the maps actually take a decent amount of time. You just have this area over here, which I actually have a little bit more space here than I was initially anticipating. I think this actually could have been stretched out a little, but that's okay. I think it works out that the ink curves inward, because otherwise I think it makes it feel a little bit too boxy. I kind of like that change. And then I can make Paroja, which is this tropical island series over here, a little bit bigger. And when you make islands, you can do pretty much whatever you want. But if you want something that feels kind of realistic, try and have areas where puzzle pieces almost fit, but not quite, or look like they could have fit at one point. So for example, there's a pointy area of Paroja over here, and there's a cove over here. And these are not the same shape. The cove doesn't pull in like this, it's a little wider, but you assume that the general shape is going to fit. So like a curved area here and a curved area here could potentially fit. And then you add little pieces to show that things have broken off over the like millennia, however long this has been here. I think it's been like, the year is like 7012 in on the calendar, but that's only how long people have been around to keep track of the years. So I would imagine the world is older than that. So giving a slight curve to this, a slight bulge to this. This one has a more distinct curve. It just gives the impression that these things were once connected, but have been separated for a very long time. Another cool thing you can do is think about what these things used to be. So if these things are not masses of land, but are maybe built on top of bone or stone or something else, think about what they could have been. For example, like the tailbone or the spine of like a giant might make up, a set of islands. And so you might base it off a skeleton. Or you could have, like a building that sank that was very famous and enormous, and now there's an island here. What does the top of like a roof in that architecture style look like? But aside from that, things probably will look like they eventually would fit together if some wiggle room was made. So we have our continent map. I'm very happy with it. I quite like it. I'm just going to double check real quick and just see if I left any islands by mistake. I don't think I did. 2, 3, just counting the islands that need to be there. Nope, I think we're good. All right, great. Okay. So it's quarter tilt. Let's go ahead and we can fill in the mountains, I think. And then, yeah, and then I think we'll stop there. I'm going to avoid putting my hand here. I think the ink is probably dry by now, especially since we're doing a very thin trail, but I do not want to risk that, because then I'd have to do the whole map over if I smudged it. But I can rest my hand over here. You always want to give your hand like an anchor point. And then we're going to do significant bodies of water too. So there's a lake up here called the Spectre. I really like Amalfi. I was hoping somebody would be involved in it, but most of the backstories ended up going elsewhere. There's one character with kind of mysterious origins, so I don't know, maybe they'll end up being from there. They haven't told me yet, but we shall see. It's sort of like a land of seers where like the veil between the worlds is known to be the thinnest. So people will go there for like, I don't know, mushroom trips and religious journeys. But there's like a lot of like weird witchy fae-like things that happen. It's just like a sort of strange, almost unearthly place. And it's like you might see something there that you wouldn't expect to see, but it's a little bit like Lewis Carroll's like Alice in Wonderland, where everything is curiouser and curiouser, but only to an extent. And it's not like you're in a different plane or anything. Okay. A lot of really big mountains up here. At this point, I'm watering my ink down a little bit. I don't want this to be too dark now that I'm adding a lot of detail. And then there's this really big, significant body of water. And there's the grotto. So I think we can do the grotto. Let's do the grotto next, because that's very important and significant. That should be done with some dark ink. All right, so we have some areas over here. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the grotto and the different continents, MissGuided Magic, which is our all-fun D&D 5e homebrew group, is going to be playing in this world. And we start at 4:30 Pacific time or 7:30 East Coast time. And we'll be doing another one-shot just to introduce the characters today. Right after this stream. And then we're also going to be starting the main campaign the following week. And I need to check. I know we're going to be doing like a 15 or 16 episode season, but it's D&D and you never know what players will do. So that is a tentative schedule. Could be a little shorter, could be a little longer. And it'll take place in the continent Fendere over here. But the backstory one-shots are going to be in Bertalhen, which is the northern continent of the grotto, up over here. Actually, this is where they're going to be today. They're going to be in Lahinam, I think is the name of the city. I will check. I'm just trying to keep it kind of nice and somewhat illustrated because it's a significant landmass and it's got all these cool poisonous fungi and stuff coming out of it. Which I don't think the mushrooms are actually out there, but I don't know, maybe they are. Okay, so generally if you're doing something with a top and a bottom to it, draw the bottom first and then draw things above it. 15 episodes are scheduled at the outset. We should have 15 episodes at least. And it's going to be divided into seasons. So the way I see it are the campaign is going to be a number of seasons and each season is an arc. So the theme of the arc for this season is going to be coming together. It's the initial arc / battle mission, whatever, that the party is given in order to come together and become who they are and to get sort of hooks of plot stuff. And then each subsequent arc is going to be based on one or more characters' backstories. So we're anticipating like 5 to 6 seasons then, I would say, for the whole campaign, since it's a long-term campaign. However, players sign on for different seasons. So if we lose a player due to scheduling or something, they'll finish out the arc so that the story doesn't feel fragmented. And we may have to rearrange the plot based on a couple of things. There are 2 characters that the main plot is really based on. So hopefully we'll keep them. They seem pretty invested, so. All right. But I love basing plots off different characters' backstories. I think it's so fun because the player feels just significantly more involved if the big bad is their stepmother, like whoever else it's from. The big bad is not someone's stepmother, but that would be great. And this is sort of minimal detail for now. And we're going to come back and add more detail, but I want to add more detail either with a brush or with a much lighter wash, because I don't want there to be a lot of areas that are broken up or super, super dark or emphasized. So if you do that with a lighter color, it feels a little bit more like shading and it feels more kind of fun and nuanced. All right. And coming all the way up to here even, we have mountains. Noticing there's a little bit of wet ink here. I don't want to mess up what I just drew. So today for the one shot, we're going to be seeing a few new characters. So last week we saw Beetle and Scoria, who are Fire Genasi, Cleric Warlock, and our Tabaxi Druid. And today we are going to be seeing Julienne, who is our half-elf cleric, and we're going to be seeing Han, who is our drow ranger, and then our orc rogue is also going to be appearing. So it's going to be a 3-person one-shot. I'm very excited for it. I have played with Allison before, who's playing our orc rogue. She was in my long-term home game. It's actually how I found Rainbows and Razor Blades. She was affiliated with them. And I have played with Beth quite a bit, but I have not played with Han before. So I'm excited to see our other player. It was a really fun surprise because I hadn't played with Kristen or Abby last week. But I knew Abby came really highly recommended, and I'd seen Kristen DM before. So I was excited to see them together as players, and they had really wonderful chemistry. So I'm excited to see the rest of the team come together and kind of see how everyone works. I feel kind of bad because I stuck Beth, who has a really friendly character, with the two really emo surly characters. But hopefully it'll work out. I love this Sunshine Brumph dynamic, so we'll see how it goes. But I get the feeling that Julienne and Scoria will get along really well. Right. And these are Great Lakes. They're huge. So there's a ton of cities in here, but Amalfi is this chunk here. We have Bertogen here. Vendere, which there's a mountain range from here to here. And then there's a little pocket carved out for the pirate city. And then we have 2 countries here that don't really have much of a border. But there's a lot of grasslands in between. There's a coastal city, and then there's a coastal country, and then another coastal country, and then some trader caravans in the middle. Let's do the pirate city. Country. Keep saying city. And these mountains have a really specific look to them. So I'm going to be a little bit more careful when I draw them. These are the Windrake Mountains. And the mountains, no one's entirely sure why, but they are carved in spirals, and the spirals trap pockets of air. So when people first explored them and declared them impassable, they declared them riddled with dragons because the pockets of air make it sound like there's like this insane roaring. But then dragons got wind of it and they actually settled there because they liked the idea that even if they decided to roar at their prey, like no one would know they were coming. So part of the reason this pirate city does so well is because there are dragons that live in the mountains and people are too scared to cross them. So I want to make sure that I emphasize some of those spirals so that they feel like really unique pieces of land. Trying to think of what else I can talk about. I feel like I've exhausted a lot of map tips in general. But if anyone has any questions about map making or world building stuff, feel free to ask. Usually mountains help to sort of funnel and channel water into natural streams. So oftentimes if you have a lake forming and it's not connected to the ocean, it's going to be connected to a mountain, which is why I have these lakes kind of funneling down from the mountain to kind of come out over here. All right, and I think that's like over half the land masses for the city. So at this point, I think we're probably, because it's 6 p.m. or, well, we've been streaming 2 hours. I guess the time changes depending on what time zone you're in. But I think we're at about the halfway point here. We have to fill in everything, like all the other land masses, and then some of the small tree areas and label everything. We're going to save that for next week because this is a longer piece. So I think we're going to make it a 2-stream project. Then we're going to be back doing character art for, oh shoot, it's not Solemn Exterior, it's the Arches. The Arches one, what's it called? I feel so bad. It's our other long-term campaign at Rainbows and Razor Blades. And we have a number of other characters who have already turned in their character information that we are going to be doing art for it. Yes, it is called At the Threshold. Next week, they are starting back up again. And after the map is finished, we're going to be moving on to be doing the characters for the PCs for that campaign. And that should last another month or so. And then after that, we might end up doing more maps depending on what city our other characters are at in the MissGuided Magic game, or we might be doing significant NPCs or other characters if we end up starting a new campaign or a mini campaign at Rainbows and Razor Blades. But just to go over a couple of things that we want to plug. Next week, everything that is on break will return. This Thursday at 5:30 p.m., there's going to be a one-shot for Stealing Stories for the Devil by Monty Cook. And this is Watercolored Wizardry. We'll be back next week, and tune in at 4:30 p.m. Pacific time for MissGuided Magic.